She could have been Queen of England, but instead her bloodline doomed her. This is the story of Lady Arbella Stuart. Prepare yourselves for multiple scandalous and secret marriages, daring escapes from England, and a tragic end in one of the most infamous prisons ever. This is how being almost royal can really ruin your life. Lady Arbella Stuart was born in 1575 into a combination of the Tudor and Stuart royal families. To understand how she fitted into the complicated dynastic web that existed in both England and Scotland at the time, we need to look at her family tree, and at how it tied her to the monarchies of both countries. It all started with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. They had 3 children who survived to have children of their own. One was, of course, Henry VIII, father of Elizabeth I, who was Queen of England at the time of Arbella's birth. Another was Princess Margaret Tudor. Through her first marriage, Margaret was the ancestor of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her son James VI of Scotland. Through her second marriage, she produced Arbella's paternal grandmother, Lady Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, who then had 2 sons called Henry Lord Darnley, who married his half-cousin Mary Queen of Scots and father James VI, and Charles Stuart, Earl of Lennox, who married Elizabeth Cavendish and became Arbella's father. Henry VII did have one other child who survived to adulthood, and that was Mary Tudor Brandon, Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk. Her descendants will become very important later on. So, Arbella was the niece of Lord Darnley and Queen Mary, and a first cousin of their son, who became king after his mother was deposed and forced to abdicate in 1567. Darnley had by then already met a sticky and very suspicious end earlier that year, while his father, Arbella's paternal grandfather, was dead before her birth too, having gone to Scotland to rule as regent for his grandson King James, only to be murdered in 1571. Arbella was also a distant cousin of Elizabeth I. On her mother's side, she was the granddaughter of the famous Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, better known as Bess of Hardwick, and one of the best-known courtiers of the Elizabethan era. Just to make the whole family situation even more complex, Beth and her 4th husband, the Earl, who was not the father of her children, were also jailers to Mary Queen of Scots during her imprisonment in England. Arbella's life was scandalous right from the start, with her very conception. Charles Stuart and Elizabeth Cavendish's marriage had been conducted in secret, that is, in secret from the Queen, for both their formidable mothers knew about it, and it took place in 1574 at Orphaned Abbey after a courtship of just a few days. It caused a scandal given Charles's links to the English and Scottish thrones, and the suspicion that there was some sort of plot afoot to put him or his offspring on the throne of England. His mother, Lady Lennox, was briefly imprisoned for her part in the match, though Lady Shrewsbury seems to have gotten away with the whole thing. Arbella had certainly been born by the 10th of November 1575, when she is mentioned in a letter from her grandmother Margaret Douglas to her aunt, the former Scottish Queen, but we don't know the exact date of her birth. Nor can we be sure why such an unusual name, which is sometimes later recorded as Arabella, was chosen. Her biographer, Sarah Gristwood, whose book was my main secondary source for this video and which is linked below for you, suggests that it might have been a nod to the long-dead Scottish Queen, Annabella Drummond. See my video on the Scottish royal line up to the time of James VI to hear more about her. And if you join my Patreon page at patreon.com/historycalling at either the historical figure or time traveller tiers, you'll also get a review of Gristwood's book this week. Even if you just fancy dipping your toe in at one of the lower tiers, however, you'll still get access to that tier's back catalogue of content, including my monthly bonus podcasts, which go out to all paid members and which take you behind the scenes of History Calling a bit more. I'll leave it linked below if you want to take a nosy. Arbella spent her early years in the house of her paternal grandmother in Hackney, and she was to be the sole product of her parents' illicit union. Her father died in 1576 when she was still in the first year of her life. Her grandmother, Margaret Lady Lennox, followed him to the grave in 1578, and Arbella's own mother, Elizabeth, would pass away too in January 1582. Arbella should have inherited her father's Scottish earldom of Lennox, but the Scottish Regency government for the still underage James VI wouldn't let her have it, or the lands which went with it. Both were bestowed elsewhere. In fact, she had very little money to her name beyond a £200 per annum annuity granted by the Queen when she was packed off to be raised by her other grandmother, Bess of Hardwick. Before we get to the remainder of her childhood, let's pause to consider Arbella's position in the line of succession. At birth, she had a pretty good claim to the throne. If we were using blood seniority only, then Queen Elizabeth's first heir was Mary Queen of Scots, followed by her son James, followed by Arbella's father, then Arbella herself. Henry VIII, however, had stipulated in his will that if none of his children had legitimate children of their own, which is exactly what happened, then the throne was to pass to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor Brandon. Her senior surviving grandchildren had been the Grey sisters, the ladies Jane, Catherine and Mary. Only Catherine had children, but her sons were the product of another illicit marriage to Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, which Queen Elizabeth had declared void, rendering its offspring illegitimate. See my video on Catherine's tragic life, which mirrored Arbella's in quite a startling number of ways, to learn more. Mary Tudor Brandon did have another granddaughter, Lady Margaret Clifford, Countess of Derby, who might have been able to make a claim based on her uncle Henry's will, but honestly, she and her children were so far down any potential line of succession that they don't matter much to this particular story, and in any case, she disgraced herself and landed in prison when she had an astrologer predict the Queen's death. While we're on the subject of family trees, by the way, if you have Irish ancestry, do consider buying my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook or paperback, and linked below for you. It should hopefully help you to trace your family line from the comfort of your own home. As Mary, Queen of Scots, was in prison and her son was a foreigner, that left the English-born Arbella and her father with a very solid claim. When Charles Stuart, Earl of Lennox, died in 1576, Arbella took one step closer to the throne. When her aunt, Mary Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587 after plotting to seize the crown, she took another. If we ignore Henry VIII's will, she was now second in line after her cousin James VI of Scotland until he had children, and as I've said, she didn't suffer the impediment of being born in another country. The upshot of all this is that Arbella was strategically important. She had a very real claim on the throne, which rendered her a threat to the ageing, childless, and technically illegitimate Queen Elizabeth, and to the aspirations of James to combine his Scottish crown with that of England. She wasn't quite royal herself, but she was so close to these two thrones that it would overshadow her whole life. We can't know how much of this she appreciated in her early years. She continued to live with her grandmother Bess, often at Hardwick Hall, and she was very well educated and bright, probably on a par with Queen Elizabeth herself actually, who is famous for her learning. In 1607, the Venetian ambassador would describe her as being not very beautiful, but highly accomplished, for besides being of the most refined manners, she speaks fluently Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, reads Greek and Hebrew, and is always studying. She also learned music and embroidery and would always retain a love of reading. She was apparently a good, virtuous Tudor lady, though as Gristwood points out, living with the imperious Bess of Hardwick can't have been a smooth ride much of the time, especially as Bess's fourth marriage to Lord Shrewsbury disintegrated under the financial strain of supporting the Scottish Queen and maintaining Bess and her offspring in the manner to which they had become accustomed. Gristwood further notes that there's nothing to suggest any particularly close relationship between Lady Arbella and her imprisoned aunt, Queen Mary, but the two surely met on occasion, and Mary left her little niece her Book of Hours, which had travelled with her from France to Scotland to her imprisonment in England. There was vague talk when the child was young of marrying her to Lord Denbigh, the son of Queen Elizabeth's great favourite Robert, Earl of Leicester, but those plans literally died when the boy himself expired. There was talk too of making Arbella King James's queen, thereby combining their two claims on the English throne. This would have solved a number of problems, but it came to nothing, and James ultimately married Anne of Denmark in 1589. The Duke of Parma's son was a possibility as well, but again the plan foundered, as did James's suggestion that she marry his cousin Ludovic Stuart. In 1587, at the age of 11, it was time for Arbella to be presented to the Queen at court. The meeting took place during one of Elizabeth's progresses at Theobald's, owned by her great minister, Lord Burleigh, and it went well, with Arbella even allowed to eat with the monarch. Court appearances reinforced her proximity to the throne, though, making them uncomfortable for Elizabeth, and they seemed to enhance Arbella's own opinion of herself to dangerous levels. Another visit in 1588, this time while the court was at Greenwich, ended badly, though we aren't sure exactly why. It seems, though, based on a much later and probably not entirely accurate account from the Venetian ambassador written in 1603, that Arbella had been throwing her weight around, insisting that she be given precedence over everyone but the Queen, until Elizabeth herself put her in her place, sending her away from court and back to Derbyshire. All Arbella said of it was that she was disgraced in the presence at Greenwich and discouraged in the lobby at Whitehall. By contrast, Rosalind K. Marshall, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, says that the incident stemmed from the 12-year-old's relationship with a new favourite, the Earl of Essex, with whom she was apparently seen talking in a too familiar manner. This has a ring of authenticity too, as Arbella would always consider Essex a friend and mourned him after his execution in 1601. In 1590, shortly before his death, her step-grandfather, the Earl of Shrewsbury, also commented on the fact that he had heard that her behaviour at court had been misliked, and suggested that Arbella was becoming difficult for her grandmother Bess to handle. Nevertheless, she was back at court in 1591 into 1592, and all seemed to have been forgiven, perhaps on account of her youth. As well as an increasing acquaintance with Elizabeth, Arbella was now also in correspondence with her cousin King James, who first wrote to her in December 1591 when she was 16. It was the beginning of a relationship which was to ruin her life, for though James started with kindness and flattery, he would ultimately become her greatest foe. That was all many years in the future, though. For now, the 1590s seem to have passed by fairly quietly for Arbella, who remained with her grandmother at Old Hardwick Hall, then, by the end of the decade, in the new Hardwick Hall, built right next door and famous for its many windows. Few records exist for this period to tell us about her day-to-day life. As quiet as it may have been for her, though, Christwood argues that this was the time when her claim on the throne was at its height, when she might really have inherited it had Elizabeth died a decade earlier, before James had a son, which didn't occur until 1594, with another following in 1600, and when Arbella was younger and still of a more marriageable age. Indeed, there were a couple of plots in the 1590s, which came to nothing, to kidnap her and replace Elizabeth with her. As time went on, though, James's position as a potential heir became stronger as he built alliances with English nobles, had more children, and gained rulership experience, while Arbella's star began to sink. Gradually, the English nobility were, by and large, persuaded that the Scottish king was the better choice, and it became clear that Elizabeth was not going to allow Arbella to marry either and produce more potential heirs, just as she herself had refused to wed and had lashed out at Lady Catherine and Lady Mary Grey when they had dared to marry and, in Catherine's case, breed. Just like them, Arbella's proximity to the throne was what made her both so eligible as a bride and yet also a forbidden one. This would have been frustrating enough, but she was also being kept in a kind of house arrest by her grandmother, and still treated like a child when she was well into adulthood. Bess described how the young woman was allowed to visit no one, could only walk near the house and with plenty of attendants, saw her grandmother almost every hour of the day, and slept in the same room as her. At the time, Bess said that Arbella was still loyal to her and respectful of her, but that wouldn't last. As her virtual imprisonment continued, and she did later call Hardwick her prison, as did others who knew what her life there was like, she and Lady Shrewsbury began to fight more and more as Arbella's misery increased. By the turn of the 17th century, the situation was becoming intolerable for the younger woman, now in her mid to late 20s, and she began to contemplate a very unwise marriage to get her out of the life in which she found herself. At the start of the 1600s, a suggestion had been made that she marry the oldest grandson of Lady Catherine Grey, a boy called Edward Seymour, born in 1587, and therefore some 12 years younger than Arbella, who had never even met him as far as we can tell. If not for Elizabeth refusing to recognise Catherine's marriage, he would also have been a strong claimant for the crown according to Henry VIII's will. Such a union, even aside from the age difference and youth of the groom, would not have been smart. Allying herself with another claimant would have looked like the beginnings of a coup, and luckily for Arbella, nothing came of the idea at the time. It clearly stuck in her mind, though, for a few short years later, at the end of 1602, either in desperation to get away from her grandmother or with an eye on the crown, she tried to resurrect the plan herself. It led her into serious trouble. She managed to get a verbal message to Catherine Grey's widower, the Earl of Hertford, to the effect that he should send his grandson to Hardwick Hall with a token to prove his identity, the inscribed book Lady Jane Grey had sent to her sister Catherine just before her execution was suggested, along with some other man who could distract Bess, while young Edward and Arbella met and decided if they liked each other well enough to wed. She had completely mistaken what Hertford's reaction to such a proposal would be, though. Scarred from years of punishment for crossing Elizabeth I, which included being imprisoned, separated from his wife and children, and seeing his boys declared illegitimate and his wife perish in her 20s of a broken heart, he wouldn't risk the Queen's wrath again. He immediately turned Arbella in. Her messenger, a man called Doddridge, was imprisoned, and a formal inquiry was launched. Sir Henry Bruckner was sent to Hardwick Hall by the Queen and her Privy Council to interrogate Arbella and her family, where he arrived in January 1603. At first, Arbella denied everything, but when faced with Doddridge's confession, she eventually had to make one of her own, though it was a while before Bruckner could get a coherent version of events out of her, as she seemed out of her wits with fear. She did admit that most of what she was accused of was true, though, but soon after also made a bizarre claim that she had a secret lover, who she eventually named as King James of all people, which was a total lie, of course, and begged forgiveness. Luckily for her, despite the seriousness of her marriage plot and strange behaviour, the Queen was disposed to give such forgiveness, and Arbella was basically told to keep her nose clean and be smarter in the future. She and her grandmother were both sick of their living arrangements by this point, with Bess asking Elizabeth to put Arbella elsewhere or else let her marry, and describing a relationship which had descended into hate on both sides. Arbella's own surviving letters from this period, which are long and rambling with their claims of a non-existent lover, even suggest that she was cracking under the strain of the life she was being forced to lead, and soon after the Seymour marriage debacle, she began to refuse food in an apparent attempt to force Bess and the Queen to grant her freedom, and seemed to suggest at other times that she might do herself mischief. That's an allusion to a word starting with the letter S that YouTube doesn't like us to say. It is incidents like these which have led some to wonder, then and now, if Arbella was actually mentally unhinged, or was even suffering from porphyria, which can cause mental imbalances. Elizabeth's minister, Robert Cecil, son of William Lord Burleigh, upon being presented with one of these incoherent missives, wrote that she had some strange vapours to the brain. At such a remove, though, it is impossible to say, and her outbursts and odd behaviour may simply be the product of the virtual imprisonment she had endured for years, infantilized by her grandmother, cut off from the outside world, monitored all the time, and basically left to rot. Catherine of Aragon's sister, Queen Joanna the Mad, had suffered a somewhat similar fate, though she was even more isolated by her father, husband and son, who all wanted control of her realms, and eventually it really did drive her mad, though in her younger days she probably wasn't so. It may also be that Arbella was just desperate for attention. Despite her obvious misery, though, the Queen remained immovable. Grandmother and granddaughter were to stay together. Bess's son Henry did attempt to remove Arbella in early March with his niece's connivance, but not his mother's, but the plan fell through. Weeks later, on the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth died, an event which would have huge repercussions for Arbella. After all the years of wondering who would succeed, in the event, James VI of Scotland became James I of England in a remarkably smooth transfer of the crown. Arbella's chance of a throne and greatness were gone. Still, it was nevertheless a positive change in her life to have her first cousin on the throne, for initially he treated her quite well. She was immediately allowed out of Bess's custody, to the delight of both women, I imagine, and after a brief stay at Rest Park was told to come to Greenwich to meet the king in May. She was allowed to choose where she would now live, and so moved to apartments in Sheen Palace. There were early problems with money. She had no lands of her own, and her pension from Elizabeth ceased with the Queen's death, but she was soon granted £666 to defray her immediate expenses. She was almost certainly at the coronation in July too, as one of the King's closest blood relations outside of his children. Soon she was dining with the royal couple, given precedence as a princess of the blood over every other woman save the Queen and her daughter, and allowed to carry Anne of Denmark's train. She was also made the Queen's carver of meat, though she didn't prove very good at this job by her own account, but she could continue her scholarly pursuits, and books were even dedicated to her by several authors, showing that she had indeed stepped out of the shadows of Hardwick and into the light of the royal court. There were bumps in the road in this new life, though. She didn't have enough money, as I've said, even though her pension was increased at the end of 1604, and she tired of the King's obsession with hunting, the general immorality of the court, and the childish games she was expected to play with the Queen and other ladies to pass the time. More serious was an early plot called the Main Plot, which aimed to kill James and his oldest son Prince Henry and put Arbella on the throne. She had seemingly had nothing to do with it, though Gristwood wonders if she might, and if her involvement was covered up because she agreed to provide evidence against the others involved, and with the support of Robert Cecil she emerged unscathed from the scandal, despite being its focus. Sir Walter Raleigh was not so lucky. He was found guilty of involvement in the plot and locked up in the Tower of London, though James spared his life, for now he would eventually be executed in 1618. Several other conspirators were brutally executed immediately after conviction. This unpleasantness aside, though, Arbella was now at court and finally leading an independent life. Whatever its drawbacks, it was better than being under her grandmother's thumb. She did see Bess again one last time, visiting Hardwick in 1605 when the old woman fell ill, but their relationship was still quite poor, though they exchanged gifts. She was also made godmother to Princess Mary in 1605, though that child died as a toddler, but it was a mark of respect nonetheless to gain the position in the first place. As Arbella turned 30, there was also still talk of who she might marry. The King of Poland asked for her hand in 1604, for instance, but was refused. King James was not going to allow her to marry and propagate her rival line for the throne any more than Elizabeth had been wont to do. Some things, it must have seemed to Arbella, never changed. Others did, though, for on the 13th of February 1608, Bess of Hardwick died. She was just over 80 years old. Arbella visited Hardwick soon afterwards while her grandmother lay in state, but she did not stay long enough for the funeral held 3 months later. Soon after, she bought a house in Blackfriars, and in December 1608 she survived an attack of the deadly smallpox. The following summer, she went on what Gristwood describes as a kind of royal progress to the north of England, visiting family members as she went. By early 1610, though, she would be involved in the greatest scandal of her life. We've heard already that Arbella had contemplated marrying Edward Seymour in late 1602. It was his younger brother William, however, who was more than 10 years her junior, who would actually become her husband. We don't know when or how the two met, but on the 2nd of February 1610 they became betrothed at Whitehall. Trying to ally herself with the Seymour claimants to the throne had been stupid 8 years earlier, and it was stupid now. All the more so because they had in the interim finally been declared legitimate in 1608, when the Earl of Hertford, widower of the long-dead Lady Catherine Grey, had somehow miraculously found the clergyman who had married them half a century earlier and therefore been able to prove the validity of the union. According to the terms of Henry VIII's will, which James had already had Parliament set aside, the throne should therefore have gone to William's older brother and Arbella's initial choice, Edward Seymour. Even despite the revocation of the will, King James was not going to look kindly on any attempt to unite these two alternate claims to what was now his throne. So why did Arbella do this? Well, probably out of a desperation to be married and a shortage of any other suitably high-ranking and readily available candidates, though she also seems to have had a genuine emotional attachment to William and he to her. She seems too to have believed that James would let her marry an Englishman. She was wrong. They were discovered in barely a fortnight and there was an investigation. They denied any actual marriage had occurred, and indeed it had not, said that they would not take such a step without royal permission, and William soon afterwards publicly repudiated her. Arbella was given more money as a kind of consolation prize from the king, and that seemed to be that. She went back to court life and was present at the Prince of Wales's investiture in early June. Not long after, though, in the early hours of the 22nd, she and William were secretly married at Greenwich in front of a small group of servants and friends. She was about 35, he was 22. She was now Lady Arbella Seymour. Word of the union leaked within 2 weeks, and on the 8th of July, William was hauled in front of the Privy Council and, in an echo of what had happened to his similarly reckless grandmother, promptly sent to the Tower of London. Arbella was placed in custody too, though she was sent to Lambeth to be housed under the control of Sir Thomas Parry. Though William initially denied the match, his wife admitted to it immediately and proclaimed their right to be wed to each other. Furthermore, she soon had reason to believe herself pregnant, the nightmare scenario for King James. She had apparently started to swell as early as August, which would hardly be time enough for a pregnancy unless the couple were sleeping together before their marriage, and this swelling continued into September, at which point she suffered a heavy bleed, and that seemed to be that. Possibly she had had a miscarriage, though Sarah Griswood wonders if it was a flare-up of porphyria and there had in fact never been a baby. Arbella and her husband's imprisonments continued, despite her letters and petitions to James begging for mercy. In January 1611, she heard that her husband was to be imprisoned for life and that she was to be sent north to Durham. This was a disaster. She wrote frantically to everyone she could think of to beg them to help her and intercede with the king, but nothing worked. When the time came to leave Lambeth in mid-March, Arbella refused to get out of bed to go. She was possibly genuinely ill, and literally had to be carried out into the street on her mattress before being transported to Barnet, where even the doctors agreed she was too ill to travel further. She remained there until June, apparently feigning illness towards the end of her stay, for far from being too sick to risk moving, and with no intention of going to Durham despite what she promised the king in her letters to him, she was in fact planning a dramatic escape to the continent with her husband, who would have to break out of the Tower of London to join her. On Monday, the 3rd of June, and with the help of some of her servants, Arbella dressed as a man and managed to slip out of what was effectively house arrest rather than close confinement. She then rode for the coast where she was to meet William. As for him, he was in pretty comfortable lodgings above Traitor's Gate and was allowed to move around within the precincts of the Tower. Having bribed the man who brought a cartload of hay and firewood into the Tower each day, William donned a false beard and clothes different to his own, both provided by friends, and apparently simply walked out behind the cart, having first put out that he was staying in his rooms that day with toothache so that no one would wonder where he was. He got in a boat on the Thames which was waiting for him, and he was off. Unfortunately, the timing of their two escapes was out of sync. It appears it was William who had suffered some sort of delay, and the plan began to unravel as the idea of meeting at Blackwall became impossible. William and the friends with him managed to find a ship which would take them to Calais, but they had to wait for an advantageous departure time. In the meantime, his absence had been discovered at the Tower and the pursuit was on. Arbella didn't know what was happening. She waited at Blackwall for her husband, and when eventually she was prevailed upon to get on a boat to France, had it wait in the English Channel, hoping to spot him. It was a decision which would ruin her. James I had by now heard of what was happening, and on Tuesday the 4th of June a proclamation was issued from the Palace of Greenwich for the pair's arrest. The orders reached the ships in the Channel, and one of them spotted Arbella's little boat, still waiting for William. Had she made straight for Calais when she had the chance, she would have been free. Instead, her boat was boarded on the Wednesday, and she was taken prisoner once more and returned to England. William, for his part, was still in England until Thursday, when he was finally able to set sail for France. Unlike his unfortunate wife, he made it to Ostend. Arbella, meanwhile, was taken straight to the building he had just vacated, the Tower of London, while many of their accomplices, or supposed accomplices, including her aunt, Mary Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, were detained too, with Lady Shrewsbury also held in the Tower. This was to be the beginning of the final chapter in Arbella's life. She was interrogated, as was Mary, and accused, though never formally charged or tried, with trying to leave England without permission, which was a crime in those days. This was in addition to her already scandalous marriage. We aren't sure precisely where she was housed in the Tower, but Gristwood suggests the lodgings originally fitted up for Anne Boleyn were used. Wherever she was kept in close confinement in her rooms, not allowed the privilege of roaming around the Tower that her husband had had, or the comforts that she herself had enjoyed in her previous house arrests. She had to pay in part for her own upkeep out of money raised by selling her jewels, and she was allowed only a few of her servants. Though there was also an allowance from the Exchequer of £1,600 per annum, this was halved in 1612, and she was now even more isolated than she had been in her days at Hardwick with her grandmother. Arbella would never leave the Tower alive. Though she hoped she might be allowed out to see Princess Elizabeth's wedding in 1613 and even ordered expensive new dresses for the occasion, she was left in her prison. This certainly looks incredibly cruel on the part of James I, but just to play devil's advocate for a minute, consider what a nightmare it had been during the Wars of the Roses when there were rival lines for the throne, and the headaches the later Stuarts and Hanoverians would endure when the Jacobites were roaming continental Europe and occasionally landing in Ireland, Scotland and England, claiming that the crown was theirs. I'll leave videos on both situations linked for you below to give you another perspective on why he might have felt it for the best to stop her from living with her husband while there was still a chance she might conceive. But now, back to Arbella in the Tower. She fell out with her aunt, Lady Shrewsbury, they seem to have been able to communicate a little during their time in the Tower, and accused her of conspiring in the past to have Arbella kidnapped by Catholics and of conspiring still to break her out of the Tower and deliver her to the king's enemies. Was she lying, attention-seeking, going mad, or suffering another bout of porphyria? We aren't quite sure. She was certainly physically ill at times, though, suffering fits of distemper, as she called them. Finally, on the 25th of September 1615, aged 39 or 40, Lady Arbella Seymour, née Stuart, died in the Tower. She had been ill for a year at that point of some unknown ailment, surely only exacerbated by a refusal to eat much or regularly and her refusal to get out of bed, which led to bed sores, and in fact her post-mortem listed these issues as the immediate cause of death. The similarities to the cause of death of her grandmother-in-law, Catherine Grey, are striking. She was buried in Westminster Abbey in the vault of her unfortunate aunt, Mary Queen of Scots, with her coffin placed on top of the Queen's. So that is how the life of a woman who had been raised to hope for a throne ended in a prison. Her best adult years were probably those spent at James's court between 1603 and 1610, and her greatest mistake was certainly her marriage without permission to another contender for the crown and attempt to live freely with him in France, actions we can see as either reckless or brave, depending on how generous we want to be. Whatever our opinion of the woman herself, Arbella's story is surely a cautionary tale of the dangers of being close to the throne, but not close enough to take it. But what of her close family? Lady Shrewsbury was released in 1623 and died in 1632. William Seymour would make it back to England just 6 months after Arbella's death, and probably only because she was dead, where he was pardoned, allowed to remarry a year and a half after his first wife's demise to Lady Frances Devereux, daughter of the long-dead Earl of Essex, and have children, naming his eldest daughter after his first wife. Through another of his children, he is the ancestor of Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and therefore of the current king. He ultimately became first the Earl of Hertford, then the Marquis, then in the closing months of his life, the Duke of Somerset. He fought on the side of the Royalists in the Civil War, stayed on the good side of the exiled Charles II during the interregnum, and died in October 1660 in his early 70s. His fate could not have been more different than that of Arbella. That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please remember to give it a like, a hype, and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell on. It's all free and it really helps me out. Let me know in the comments if you think James I treated Arbella too harshly by locking her in the Tower, or if you sympathise with his point of view. For more from me, watch my video on Lady Catherine Grey's tragic story, which so closely mirrors the obstacles faced by and mistakes made by Arbella. Failing that, I'll put another couple of options on screen now that I think you'll like too. Until next time all, keep learning.